Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. It's wonderful to see such a packed house, nice and early in the morning. I'm really privileged and honored to be here with my dear friend Tim Ferriss to have a conversation this morning to kick off our conference. Probably, I assume all of you know Tim, but I just want to maybe frame Tim's background and in the context of human performance improvement and enhancement. So when I look at Tim's career and his life, and I've gotten to know him well over the years, I see someone that is engaged in this topic of human performance, peak human performance, from pretty much every perspective, right? We know best-selling author of 3 books, For Our Work Week, For Our Body, For Our Chef, all from different perspectives looking at this topic. And then you have an individual that is really a master of both designing and also self-experimenting with many different approaches of reaching peak performance, including some work that Tim has done in our lab at UCSF, looking at integrations of video games and transcranial direct current stimulation to improve performance. And then, of course, most recently is Tim's really pioneering efforts in, I would say, reinventing podcasting, where his show, Tim Ferriss Show, he explores and distills those principles and practices that many legendary high-performance leaders engage in their lives, people like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Laird Hamilton. With, I think, over 70 million downloads now, we're looking at an incredible new way of reaching people about this exciting topic. So much that I saw a label of the Oprah of audio somewhere out there online. And so it's a great pleasure to start this exciting 2 days of exploring the future with someone that has been engaged in it in such a deep way personally. So thank you, Tim.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm happy to be here. I just want to play with all the toys in the exhibition hall.
We'll have to hold you out for at least a half an hour before we unleash you on them. So let's start in the past, and then we'll move to the present and the future over our half hour together. How did this begin? How did your fascination with human performance as an individual start? Even before our work week, what happened?
The origins, I would say, came from competitive wrestling. So I was a runt growing up. I was born premature and have some respiratory issues, so my thermoregulation is a big problem, continues to be a problem. And I realized that early on, one of the few competitive advantages I had was because of that thermoregulatory screw-up, I could sweat really easily. So I decided to get really good at cutting weight. And to get good at cutting weight and ultimately to compete on a national level in high school, I was sometimes cutting 20 to 25 pounds within 18 hours, doing that twice a week. I don't recommend this, by the way. I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on the internet, so don't do that. But to do that effectively, meaning without any type of organ failure or other issues, I had to become familiar with potassium-sparing diuretics and to really start to understand basic things like electrolytes. And that led me to look at biochemistry, which led me to look at things like the interactions between something like ephedrine hydrochloride, caffeine, and aspirin, and where sort of 1 + 1 + 1 equals 5 from a sort of thermal standpoint. And that was the beginning. So that led me down the path. I focused primarily on physical performance and athletic performance for a long time. But flash forward, so I had that personal experience, which has always been, I suppose, rather primitive compared to a lot of what we're seeing in this exhibition hall and at this conference. But moved to Silicon Valley, continued to compete in various sports, and to work with other high-level athletes, through which I became familiar with, say, different types of designer drugs, which fascinated me, right? So I recently had Patrick Arnold on my podcast, who's the world's most famous black market biochemist. So he developed the drugs purportedly for Barry Bonds, Marion Jones, et cetera. And the molecular tinkering that can have such a huge output became an obsession of mine. And then I think it was 2008, sat in on the first quantified self meetup ever. I think it was late 2008, early 2009 at Kevin Kelly's house, founding editor of Wired in Pacifica. It's 25 people. And ever since have been tinkering and experimenting in sometimes legal, sometimes gray area oftentimes questionable ways. So that brings me to the present day. And the 4-hour body was really the summation of 50 of those experiments, but there are hundreds.
Before we slide into more of the present and what you're doing now and some of your inspirations, I just want to pause and note that you have some neuroscience background in your past. You might have, given certain life changes, have wound up as a neuroscientist and in this.
That's true. So undergrad at Princeton, I was initially a neuroscience major and specifically wanted to work in the lab of a gent named Barry Jacobs, who did a lot of work with cats because they sleep all the time, and serotonin, among other things, and had done, I believe, some research in LSD, which continues to be of great interest to me. And at that time, I couldn't do a lot of perfusing. I was required to perfuse a lot of rats, and I just didn't have it in me at the time. I don't have any particular issues with it. I just couldn't do it. I remember sitting down with, I think it was a grad student from the Ukraine, and she's like, before it bothered me a lot. Now I perfuse, which means like cut a rat open and bleed it over a sink, basically. Now I perfuse 40 rats, I go to lunch. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to get there. So
maybe if you started in human neuroscience.
Yeah, that's right. So I switched labs, but had some really fun opportunities, and have been a subject not only in my own experiments. I haven't really talked about this. Of course, I do my own experiments, which might not end up on the cover of Nature or anything like that. But I volunteered to be a test subject in a lot of different experiments. I mean, at UCSF, I wanted to not only try to play the part of experimenter, really just with training wheels following you guys around, but be the subject. And I was in some of Daniel Kahneman's experiments at Princeton. I was in experiments at Stanford University related to the use of a glove for cooling core body temperature, which was particularly unpleasant because you had to have 2 probes put into your body. One was an esophageal probe, which is about that long, and goes down one nostril to get as close to your heart as possible, and they tape it on the side of your nose. And then another one was up the other side for the military who was funding it, who wanted that data to compare it, and then you put on full military gear, a weighted backpack, helmet, and went into a sauna. It's like 104 degrees on an elevated treadmill and marched to heat exhaustion. Not my favorite one. Not my favorite.
And when you set upon...
Oh, but I'm sorry to interrupt. Why would I do such a thing? I wanted the data. I wanted to know why I was so weak in the heat, and I wanted to know, I just wanted the data, and I didn't have a good way to capture it. So
would you say data's always been a part of this mission for you?
It's been a big part. I mean, I have almost every workout recorded since I was 15 or 16. I still have all the logbooks. So it's very analog. I mean, I've since moved to other tools like Evernote and other things, and used, for instance, the Dexcom continuous glucose monitor way back in the dinosaur ages in 2009, I want to say, which was designed for type 1 diabetics. But the tools just get better and better and easier and cheaper and cheaper. So it's a very exciting time for me.
Yeah, and I think you'll see a lot of that here today. As you'll hear when I speak tomorrow, the relationship between recording and impacting, that loop, that closed loop that we talk about a lot, I think is critical to really have the change that we all want to have. So sensing is, just an essential part of that. Before we move on, and I want to hear a good amount about people that you've talked to on your podcast and what you've learned from them. I just want to pause because we know the 4-hour work week is coming up on its anniversary.
10th anniversary next year. I had more hair back then.
It's really been a landmark book and influential to so many people. And I mean, it's really about performance there as well. Maybe a different type of performance than you talk about in the 4-hour body and that you've just been talking about. So there's that aspect of your life too, sort of the optimization of how you interact with your environment, not just sort of optimizing your system, but optimizing this. Is that still important? How did that happen?
Yeah, it's ubiquitous. I think that I had a number of if I look at my key mentors, or many of my key mentors, whether they were wrestling coaches or other types of athletic coaches, professors in electrical engineering, they all thought through a framework that they may have called science or might not have called science, but they had a rational scientific approach to deconstructing different areas of endeavor and testing assumptions. So I think if you look at the 4-Hour Workweek, you look at the 4-Hour Body, 4-Hour Chef, anything else that I've done, it's really a matter of using the scientific method to test assumptions. And sometimes that can be as simple, or a portion of that is collecting questions, right? So that's part of the reason I enjoy the podcast so much, is I'm collecting questions. So if Peter Thiel says, why can't you achieve your 10-year goals in the next 6 months? Like, that's a pretty cool sort of thought exercise that could yield real-world results.
Right.
The what-if game, of course, the science is, I think the science, or the part of the reason I'm so excited about cheap sensors and the ubiquity of these tools is that we have, say, the peer review process and the sort of established scientific organizations that are very good for vetting information and assessing outcomes and protocols, but they're not necessarily very good at helping people to come up with novel hypotheses, right? So when you have, instead of, let's say, more than a handful, but this sort of limited community able to do these tests, gather data, share them collectively, maybe even crunch the data collectively, it's really, really exciting to me. So,
and that you would say part of the amount of self-experimentation that you have sort of been involved in is related to that. It's your way of
totally. I mean,
generating even hypotheses of what might be.
Like I've very acute elbow tendonitis right now, medial epicondylitis, so golfer's elbow on the inside here, as opposed to lateral, which would be tennis. And it's nagged me for like 10 years on and off, and I just got fed up with it. And so I started digging into, this is very recent, and so I have a number of sort of protocols that I'm testing right now. Although in the quantified self world, you have people who measure to measure, and then you have people who are very outcome driven. And sometimes if you're very outcome driven and your time horizon is very short, you care less about isolating variables in the beginning, right? So I might take 3 components. Let's say that's eccentric exercise, which has been shown to help with Achilles tendonitis. I'm doing like weighted lowering with external rotation. That'd be one variable. The second variable might be injecting compounds that are probably not something you can pick up at CVS. Potentially something very interesting like BPC 157. I don't think there have even been human trials on BPC 157, but you can find it on PubMed and do a lot of reading about it. And then there might be, say, a third component. There is a third component, which would be extracorporeal, I think that's how you pronounce that word, shockwave therapy, which is really painful, it turns out. And then if that combination of 3 works, I can then isolate after the fact. But first and foremost, I care about, we were talking about this before we got up here, sort of gymnastics training at 38, which, surprise, surprise, don't see a lot of 38-year-olds starting gymnastics and getting to the Olympics because they just kind of fall apart like the braces on Forrest Gump's legs when he runs too fast. But
Well, I think that this is a big topic, more than we could cover here, this idea of what we talk about, which is the N of 1 experiment. Maybe a little different than you heard Tim frame it, but in our lab, we conduct population studies. That's what labs do. You look for a difference between this population and this population reaching some statistical threshold. But we care about the person, not just the population. And how do we start thinking about an individual's data and what that means for them? And how does that drive them to the next level? As scientific community, we're very poor at that. And so I think there is a lot of lessons from what you've done, and how do we address it with rigor and with the statistical sort of approval and approach that we need in order to have the validation that the field is looking for. So I think somewhere there's a sweet spot of population and individual that we just have not figured out yet.
yeah, totally. And I think that what's important to realize also is it's easy to get obsessed with sample size. Or the size of a cohort, and I think that that's very important, obviously, if you're looking at how powered a study is, or the p-value, and everything else that goes into evaluating such a thing. But if you have a very small group of people, if the magnitude of change is high enough, is great enough, you can at the very least help inform building hypotheses worth disproving. And I would just encourage people to just think bigger and just bigger.
Well, it's a great audience here for that.
Yeah.
That's why everyone is probably sitting here.
So it's like, if you can hold your breath for 45 seconds, why can't you hold your breath for 5 minutes? Why can't you hold your breath for 10 minutes? Like, what would it take? There are people out there who do it.
Let's talk about that. Let's pause for one moment and think about mind, brain, and body. And is there just a couple things, because I know we could fill an hour on this, that is currently in your world? And do you think about mind and brain different than body? Do you have different approaches to keep clarity and focus in your thinking versus strength and agility in your body, or is this put together for you?
They're all one and the same in a way for me. I mean, I think the sort of Cartesian duality is a false dichotomy in a way. They're not separate at all. I mean, you have this organ that's sitting inside your skull, and if you look at, and this is somewhat dated, but there's a book called Spark, and you can certainly find research to show that most certainly aerobic exercise, and I suspect quite a bit of anaerobic exercise like lifting, is a great way to increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor and to increase neuroplasticity. It's like, get to the gym. Like, you don't need to be injecting smart drugs intravenously to get these effects. So I treat them very much as interdependent, and some of the patterns that I've noticed at the very least, if I'm interviewing world-class performers, whether it's Shaun White in snowboarding and sports, or Arnold Schwarzenegger, or Laird Hamilton, you mentioned, the undisputed king of big wave surfing, at least 80% of these people have some daily meditation practice. So my job, in large part, is not to be the expert, but to interview the experts, observe the experts who may have been doing what they've done for so long that they have trouble teaching it, to try to spot these patterns.
Let's go into that a little bit. So as you just threw out a whole series of names, I know more that I've, from listening to your podcast. What are some themes that maybe you've detected across them that has driven them to these levels of in some ways, inhuman performance, right? Really off the charts.
I think that there are at the very least a half dozen or dozen questions that people tend to ask. And one of them would be, what if I did the opposite? So if everyone is doing X and I want to achieve 10X, right? If I'm Laird Hamilton and I want to ride 100-foot waves, I mean, he's 50-something now, and he's still out there hunting for the biggest monsters on the planet. And I have seen him, because I've trained at his house, bury like early 20 professional athletes in every possible type of training you can imagine. And he's inventing new technology to achieve that. What if I couldn't use a surfboard because I can't paddle fast enough? So he created toe and surfing, basically, helped popularize it for these monster waves. What if that's not fast enough? Well, you have to build a foil. The water resistance becomes a problem. And nobody was thinking about this stuff. So now he's working on foil surfing, 100-foot waves. But what if I did the opposite, meaning if people are telling me that, for instance, I have tendinitis in my elbow, therefore I should relax my flexors. That's the only way to get this problem to help to improve. What if I did the opposite? What if I just contracted it, right? And it's just a question, and I pose that, and then this former national team coach says to me, oh yeah, we do this thing called lock-offs. What are lock-offs? Where they do this extremely contracted position on a ring and hold their hand down to ultimately relieve the form. And it's completely counterintuitive. I have no explanation for why it works. And yet it does. There are these elite Olympic level athletes who are using this precisely to fix this problem. What is the worst that could happen is another one. So they really push the envelope. And if they can mitigate their downside risk, they're willing to try almost anything. So it's like, well, if I manage the downside, the upside generally takes care of itself. And just to give you guys an example of what's possible and why if I say test the extremes, this is extremely dangerous if done in water, so don't do it. You can die of a shallow water blackout. But this guy named Wim Hof, who Laird Hamilton has trained with, and I met Wim, the Iceman, from the Netherlands. He's crazy, but he does some really amazing stuff. He can actually modulate his own immune response to being injected with different types of harmful bacteria, which has been supervised by scientists who are taking blood markers and whatnot. But using some very basic breath work that he taught me, that a lot of the athletes under Laird are using now, because of my lung issues having been born preemie, I'm usually 45 seconds. That's my max. It's really terrible. After about 15 minutes of working with him, I held my breath for 4.5 minutes on an exhale. with no perceivable negative effects after the fact. And then at a later point, I was experimenting with hyperbaric chambers at 2.4 atmospheres, which is a whole separate story. But I was doing that and held my breath for 7.5 minutes doing those breathing exercises inside a hyperbaric chamber. That's insane.
Yeah, it seems impossible.
It's completely nuts. But if you were to ask me to do that right now, right back to 45 seconds.
I see. And this is part of a bigger system of sort of improvement, right? The breath approach.
The breath sort of addresses all areas. You mentioned mind, brain, body. That is one of the sort of the underlying variables that you can play with to affect just about everything. And of course, I'm playing with, that's about as low tech, as old as you get. And then I'm also playing around with, of course, we've done the TDCS and fascinated by VR, endlessly fascinated.
I think this is a great way for us to take this to the finish line is to tie it back to what you're all going to hear in amazing detail by the world's leaders over the next 2 days. And that's this promise, this hope that technology can have an impact beyond its entertainment value, its communication, media value, but really a gateway to elevate ourselves across every domain, across every vertical that we think about people. And as Zach mentioned, from training to education to medicine, that's the dream, right? I think that probably brings the majority of you here today. Let's talk about that a little bit. High tech as medicine, as training tools, as education tools.
Well, I will just preface anything that I say to embarrass myself since I'm way out of my depth here with this audience. But I was a VR skeptic for a long time. We'll start with VR because I'd seen some very early prototypes and was just completely unimpressed. Got kind of motion sick and was not feeling it at all. And then went to Seattle and had a demo on the HTC Vive with Valve software. And I remember coming out of it and I was able to move around. I had a full room set up. And I came out and I asked them how long I had been in, expecting I'd been in for like 5 minutes, and I had been in for almost 25 minutes. And I said, okay, that type of time distortion, so I'm also helping fund research and involved with a lot of groups such as this Johns Hopkins working on entheogens or psychedelics of different types. I haven't seen anything like that or experienced anything like that outside of psychedelics. So that made me think, rethink my position. And it became very clear once you walked through this demo that I think I'm no longer investing in startups for a host of personal reasons I won't bore you with, taking a break. But I remember thinking after that demo, if I had to push all my chips in on one thing, it would probably be VR.
Yeah, I think that's just the truth about VR is that it doesn't really translate well as an explanation. You know, if you just try to have someone imagine this, it's really hard for people to get it. We have a mutual friend, Kevin Rose, who's also a VR disbeliever. And, VR
I'm a converted.
You're converted. You're on the other side. And I think once you get the full experience, and I'm sure many people here have went through that moment where you're like, wow, this is an incredibly powerful experience, and its potential is great.
I mean, for you name it, and it can revolutionize it. And I don't want to downplay AI. I just understand it much less. Half of my smart friends think it's summoning the demon. Half of my smart friends think that that's all overblown, that Luddite fallacy, this, that, and the other thing, and that it's going to change everything. Maybe both are right, but I kind of view AI as the underpinning or the jet fuel that will be added to all of these things, if not present already, right?
Yeah,
so but VR, whether it's surgery, whether it's language learning, AI is probably going to hit that first, but outside of VR. But I think it'll just have tremendous implications, and I think it will also create with it that power. Like it's a double-edged sword, right? So I think that you will find clinics, there will have to be rehab clinics for people who opt out of this reality because like the demo that I went through, as amazing as it was the Model T at best. I mean, there are no retinal scan, no retinal tracking, no haptic feedback, right? No somatic feedback.
Right. You did have audio.
What was that?
You had sound.
I had audio, but it's like once all of those pieces come together, it's like people aren't going to raise their hand here, so I'm not going to ask you, but it's like, what percentage of the population, once VR porn comes out, is just going to stop working? Like, they're just going to do nothing all day long.
All society collapses.
And like, that's coming in 5 years. Like, holy shit, we better prepare for that. That's like,
We better prepare.
people think it's going to be like, Skynet. I'm like, no, like, porn is going to disable the entire country. So.
I think your comments on AI are really interesting, and I was going to bring up AI, and we haven't even really talked about that. We've talked about most topics together over the years, but I agree with you. I think the role of AI should be to enhance us, right? I mean, this whole question of singularity and offloading this into machines, to me, is not the goal. The goal is that we can use this technology to advance us, our biology, and I think that's what you said. It is the fuel to this system, and I hope we see a lot more of that.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm a little afraid at the same time, but I mean, that's true of almost all of the experiments I do that end up being worthwhile. So.
Right. I guess one last topic is integration. As you step through our expo here, you're going to see amazing technologies, and because we're on early days, a lot of them will be presented in sort of isolation. So here's brain stimulation, here's video games, here's sensor technology, whether it's EEG or other, and not a lot of pharma. I mean, I don't know if there's any here today, but obviously molecules have been the major part of how we've actually tried to improve our brains, especially when we had deficits, but even recreationally. What are your thoughts about the future? Like, all of this seems inevitably it's going to come together. Right? And then we're going to have interactions that we might not be able to predict right now. Is that,
Yeah, no, it's exciting. I mean, I think that we'll be very shortly putting things in our body that we can then modify as they travel through our bloodstreams using technology akin to what you see out in the exhibition hall. I don't think that's far away at all. The request I would perhaps make, or warning, is that if you get really good at swinging a hammer, it's very easy to see everything as a nail. So I would just say, default to Occam's razor. Like, use the simplest solution to address a complex problem. Like, complex problems do not require complex solutions necessarily. So it could be pharma, it could be any combination of the tools out there, it could be some of the tools that many of you are thinking of building, but don't fetishize your tool. Keep in mind the problem you're trying to solve. But the integration is going to happen. A lot of people are going to force it, and there'll be terrible products, but that's totally fine. I mean, we're in Silicon Valley. This is the land of terrible products, and out of that sea of terrible things, one or two will change the world, and that's totally fine. That's how it works.
I love it. I think that's a great close. Everyone thank Tim Ferriss here for sharing with us.
Thanks, man.